welcome everyone. Just to remind everyone that these sessions are made possible by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. That's how we've been able to offer these for free. And yeah, welcome everyone to our sixth Indigenous education session. So of course, to start with the Land Acknowledgement, the Center for Race and Culture respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homeland, and that we live and work on the traditional homelands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. We honor the elders past and present who call this land home and strive to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. Of course, I include the map of Treaty 6 territory. That's the one that Musqueam, Edmonton is located in, and I always let people know that it shows a different perspective too on how maybe some people view land versus say the provincial borders, but in this case here, someone living in Saskatoon or Prince Albert is also in Treaty 6 territory, much like someone who lives in Edmonton in that case. So I always mention that my people have lived here for a long time. They come from the St. Albert, Mistahysiegan region and Lac St. Anne. And I was just talking to John how my dad's side, they come from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and he was actually born in the Northwest Territories. So it's always important to recognize the lands that we're on in the territories, just because, you know, in my case, it's where my family comes from in that regard. And there's lots of history in these areas. So, excuse me, we're at our sixth Indigenous education session, Understanding Treaties. Today we'll have John Brady McDonald. And this session here will go from 1 o'clock to around 2:30 that we have planned. Hopefully too, we'll have time too for a Q&A after. So just to remind everyone that John Brady McDonald is an âpahkowâyânaw Métis writer, artist, historian, musician, playwright, actor, activist, and former senator with the Indigenous Council Committee of the CUPE Saskatchewan. So let's welcome John Brady McDonald. And just to get more into a bit more into John's background, if any of you, if this is your first time hearing about John, let me go back though, click too much. If this is your first time hearing about John, though, I know there have been some articles actually showcasing his work and a bit of his journey also. So you might have seen him actually pop up in the media recently. But John Brady McDonald is an âpahkowâyânaw Métis writer, artist, historian, musician, playwright, actor, and activist born and raised in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He is from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and the Mistawassis âpahkowâyânaw, the great-great-great-grandson of Chief Mistawassis and of the Plains Cree, and as well as the grandson of the famed Métis leader, Jim Brady. John's writings and artwork have been displayed in various publications, private and permanent collections and galleries around the world, including the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. John is one of the founding members of the PA Lowbrow Art Movement and served as vice president of the Indigenous Peoples Art Collective for nearly a decade. John also served as the vice chair of the board of directors for Spark Theatre and as senator with the Indigenous Council Community of CUPE Saskatchewan. John is the author of several books and has had his written works published and presented around the globe. John has studied at England's prestigious University of Cambridge, where in July 2000 he made international headlines by symbolically discovering and claiming England for the first peoples of Americas. John is also an acclaimed public speaker who has presented in venues across the globe, such as the Skulk Aboriginal Aboriginal Literature Festival and the Black Hill Seminars on Reclaiming Youth and the Appalachian Mountain Seminars. The Appalachian Mountain Seminars, the Edmonton and Fort McMurray Literary Festivals, the Eden Mills Writers Festival, and at the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Very cool. John was honored with the opportunity to speak in Australia in April of 2001. John was also included in the Aboriginal Artists and Performers Inventory for the 2010 Olympic Winter Games in Vancouver, BC. John's work and writing have been nominated for several awards, including the 2001 Saskatchewan Aboriginal Youth Achievement Award, and John was awarded the 2017 BOB Award for Best Artist. He has been honored with several grants also from the Saskatchewan Arts Board, and a noted polymath. John currently lives in northern Saskatchewan. So I'm very excited to have John here with us. I think he's going to bring a very important perspective that we need to hear on treaties. Just hearing also that, you know, the great grandson of Chief Mistawasis, and also to having that connection with being the grandson of the famed Métis leader Jim Brady. You know, and just the work that you've done through your you know, just through your life in that regard. I think I'm just very excited to hear what you'll have, or the story that you'll have to share, and what you have to say about the treaties in that regard. So just to let everyone know, this session is about treaties. If this is your first time hearing about treaties, what is a treaty? A treaty is a binding formal agreement, a contract, or other written instrument that establishes obligations between two or more subjects of international law, primarily states and international organizations. That comes from Britannica.com. And in Canada, treaties protect, or they can protect, the collective rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada, while the Canadian Charter rights and freedoms protect the individual rights of Canadians. Collective rights are held by a group. In contrast, individual rights are held by an individual people. So just to remind folks with the saying of we are all treaty people, we all have responsibilities, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, to uphold what has been set out in the historic treaties. To be an ally is to walk alongside Indigenous peoples and to uplift their voices and support their causes. You must be genuine when it comes to that relationship building with Indigenous peoples. Much like any relationship, the way I view it, you must nurture it on a day-to-day basis. So that's pretty much all I have to share right now for this session. I think I'll hand it over to John, just because I'm very excited just what he has to share in that case for this session. So I'm going to click the stop share button, and I am going to hand it over to my friend John.
All right, thank you very much. Tanse. I want to apologize first of all. I'm battling a little bit of strep throat, so I'm if I stop, if I'm coughing, if I choke, I apologize for that. Nia mistachigan kwakatu. That's in Cree, in my language. My name is Coyote Starving, basically starving coyote. I'm very honored to be speaking here today. I'm coming from my ancestral territory of Treaty 6 territory. I'm in northern Saskatchewan right now. I'm about half an hour north of the city of Prince Albert, just on the edge of the boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan. And we're just coming out of a deep freeze right now. This time last week was minus 50 with the wind chill. So now it's I think we're at -3, so it's almost balmy. I want to thank my friend here for that introduction. I always kind of get a little embarrassed when I hear my bio read, because it's somebody said, "Oh, boy, that's long." Well, I've been a busy guy, but at the same time, it's humbling. It's always a very humbling thing to hear that, because in our culture, in Indigenous culture and Cree culture, we're not ones to kind of toot our own horns. We're not ones who are, you're taught humility. You're to remain humble. You're not taught to be boastful. And so for us as Indigenous people who have, to come kind of toot our own horn, it's always an uncomfortable thing. But at the same time, it provides, it provides within me gratefulness that I've been able to do as much as I have with the time I have here. The talk I'm going to give today, first of all, while through the bio it might sound like I'm an academic, I'm not approaching this as an academic. I'm going to talk to you today and share my stories, my family stories. I'm very, very honored that my family has played a major role in Canadian in the history of this place that's called Canada, and in particular with treaties, in particular Treaty 6. I'm very honored to come from a family that has a history steeped in these relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The members of my family I'm going to talk about, when we address our ancestors, we acknowledge the gifts they've given us and acknowledge the path that they tread. And I'm going to share a little bit about what, when we talk about treaties, both in what happened in the past and how it's affecting us today, and certain things, you know, from events that are happening that started in the 1860s to something that, you know, began July 1st or January 1st this year. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, not from an academic perspective, but from a personal perspective, and how these things affect, you know, even to this day, how these treaties that we made, these agreements that we made with with the Queen, how that how they continue to affect us today. In Saskatchewan, I'm where I live. I was born and raised in Saskatchewan. There are 7 numbered treaties within the borders just of Saskatchewan. We have Treaty 2, Treaty 4, Treaty 5, Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and Treaty 10. And in this little tiny corner, just like maybe, no, I don't even know if it's 100 kilometers even, a little tiny, if you look at a treaty map, there's this little tiny triangle at the bottom, a Treaty 7. So within you, when you hear a land acknowledgement, you will acknowledge, you'll hear the speaker acknowledging the different peoples. And within Saskatchewan, in terms of Indigenous cultures, we have my culture, the Cree, the Nehiyawak. We have the Dene up north. We have the Dakota, and the Dakota people are descendants of, you know, in many cases, we have Wahpeton, Dakota, just north of PA, just south of where I am, and the Whitecap Dakota, Saskatoon. These are the descendants of Sitting Bull. These are the descendants of when Sitting Bull brought his people north across the Medicine Line, across the Canadian border, and those are their people. We have the Nakota, which kind of the term that used to get used was a Assiniboine. They don't use that anymore. The term is Nakota. The Lakota, which is again that another branch of the people that came with Sitting Bull across the border, and the Soto people, and so we acknowledge, when you hear a land acknowledgement being given like that within the confines of the treaty, we're in this treaty territory here. When you hear that, you're acknowledging those people that came Kayas long ago, those people that were here long ago, and you acknowledge that. It just can't stop at that land acknowledgement though. And that's one thing we're going to talk about, is when we're talking about treaty relations, you know, it's got to be more than just acknowledging what the people. It's about building relationships and connecting with those individuals. We also, you'll hear in a land acknowledgement, you hear the traditional homeland of the Métis. I'm very honored that in my history, one of my ancestors, my great grandfather, was a man named Laurent Garneau. He was with Louis Riel at Red River in 1869. And the family lore has it that he might have been in 1885 in the resistance in 85. We don't know, because there were several Métis warriors that they were shadow warriors. They didn't want to acknowledge that they were there. But for sure he was a confidant to Riel. And he went after leaving Red River, he actually went to Edmonton, and he was part of the original people that settled Edmonton, the Métis people that settled Edmonton. And there is a portion of Edmonton that's still known as Garneau. So my connections from one end of treaty territory to the other, you know, that's the land we walk upon, the land I walk upon every day, that has my DNA in it. Thousands of years of my ancestors continuously walking this land, living upon this land, surviving upon this land. That connection to you walk in the bush, you see a tree, you see a rock. You know, how many of my ancestors walked past that same rock? You know, how many of my ancestors put their hands on that rock, went to that grandfather, that grandmother, and offered tobacco? So when you have that deep connection to the land, where you can go back and say, my ancestors, not just my grandparents, my ancestors going back thousands of years have connections to that land. It's a very, it means these treaties that we made mean that much more. I'm very fortunate that when Treaty 6 was signed, the first signature on that treaty was Chief Mistawasis. That was signed at Fort Carlton in 1876. Chief Mistawasis was my great grandfather. He was a little guy. He was a little man. He probably wasn't more than 5 feet tall. If you look at pictures of him, there's a picture of, if I can find it in one of these books, I'll show you. He's just he's just a little guy. But the funny thing is, Mistawasis in Cree means a big child, a big kid. So when you're given that title to be a big, if you're a little person, if you're small, given that title, you carry the weight of a lot of people. When he touched the pen, when they signed treaties, a lot of times many Indigenous leaders, we didn't have this access to learning how to sign our names. A lot of times you had a process where you take the pen and make an X, but there was also something called touching the pen, where the leader would touch the pen, and then the Indian agent, the white person there in representation, would sign. When those chiefs signed that, they saw the writing on the wall. They knew that the way of life that we'd had since time immemorial was changing, that the buffalo were going, that our people were starving. I remember my grandmother telling me of times where they'd beaten gophers. They'd beaten, they catch a scrawny little rabbit, and every single part of the rabbit would get eaten, and they'd be they'd be so hungry they'd be cracking open the rabbit bones to get the marrow inside. They were starving, and they saw what happened to our relatives in the States. They saw that the response from the government was often cannon and Hotchkiss guns. They saw what was happening, and those leaders knew they didn't want that for their their descendants. They didn't want that for their grandchildren. They wanted a better future. They wanted to share. And where we were located in this area, the relations that we had with our non-Indigenous visitors were strong. My skin's not light for odd a coincidence. My grandfather, my great grandfather, Chief Mistawasis, his son-in-law was a man named James Drever. James Drever was an Orcadian Scot. He came from the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland, and he married one of Chief Mistawasis's daughters. This happened lots. If you go into many Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan today, you will find many surnames that are European surnames: Mackenzie, Eisbister, Drever. You'll see Sinclair, Mackay, Twat. You'll hear all these Scottish, English, Irish surnames that are part of that. When these visitors came, they would come with the Hudson's Bay Company, and they would take Indigenous wives and have Indigenous children. And that's we're the living descendants of colonization. This light skin we have is a permanent reminder that happened. When those leaders, they saw what was happening, they knew they had to protect their young people. They had to protect what was coming. And to be the person to make that decision, to be the person that say, we have Right now we have unfettered access to walk this land. But as we walk, we're going hungry. There's less and less of this, of the what we need to survive. Our people are getting sick. Our people are dying. And that was a calculated move upon on the part of the government. The decimation of the buffalo. I don't like using the term starved into submission, but we kind of were. We were painted into a corner. And those leaders had to make a decision. And that decision was to sign treaty. And to sign it not as subservient. When we approached it, we weren't coming as subservient. We were coming to it as on an equal plane. It always hasn't been that case. You know, a lot of promises were made in those treaties, and very, very few of them were kept. And the ones that were kept are kind of kept in not a very good way, and I'll get into that in a little bit. I'm very fortunate to have had not only one, but two great grandparents at treaty signing, actually. Chief Mistawasis signed. He was the first chief. The second one to sign was his cousin, Chief Watakaku, Star Blanket. They were the first two chiefs to put their name on that piece of paper. You go a little farther down that list. If you ever get a chance to look at a copy of treaty, an actual, they're beautifully written, you know, Her Majesty the Queen, yada yada, and it goes through all this, and you'll see the names, and the names are all phonetically, the chiefs are all phonetically laid out. and you know, it's Mistawasis, âpahkowâyânaw. If you go farther down, there's one there, Chief Âpahkowâyânaw. Âpahkowâyânaw was on my dad's side from the Muskeg Lake. He was the chief that took treaty. When they signed that treaty, the understanding was we would be given these smaller portions of land. And in exchange to be moved to these smaller little portions of land, the government would have access to the rest of it for homesteaders, for logging, for whatnot, for farming, to put that railroad through. The sizes that we were promised of land were negotiable, we'll put it that way. My mother's family is the Mistawasis side. My father's family is the Muskeg side. Now, as the crow flies today, if you look at a map of the Mistawasis, where the Mistawasis Cree Nation is, and the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, or Muskeg, or where the Mistawasis is Muskeg, as the crow flies between the two communities, it's maybe a 20, 30 kilometer drive. Once upon a time, the only thing that separated those two communities was a barbed wire fence. On one side of that barbed wire fence was Muskeg. On the other side was Mistawasis. Slowly but slowly, after that land was taken away, pulled away. That particularly happened after the First World War, and I'll get into that in a little bit. When we hear treaty, when we hear people talking about treaty, there's a lot of misconceptions that get passed along. You know, oh, treaty people, they don't pay taxes. Treaty people, they get all this stuff for free. Treaty people, they don't do this. I'll be honest, I'm still, you know, I turned 41 this year. I'm still waiting for all this free stuff we're supposed to get. There's this misconception that, oh, my taxpayer dollars go for this, my taxpayer. When the treaties were signed, they were signed in such a way that that money, that the land that we were given was placed in trust. And the interest from that trust is what pays for things like Indigenous education, pays for things like non-insured health benefits and IHB. But you got to remember that though we're getting, when in terms of those treaty rights, they're usually the bare bones, bare minimum of what's available. One of the things that treaties promised was education. One of the things that we were promised was education. What our leaders meant was we wanted our children to be educated at the same level as non-Indigenous children. What that treaty, what that right to education, that treaty obligation education, that did not mean to take the children and put them into residential schools. I'm a residential school survivor. I was in residential school from 1984 to 1989. I always like to say that the last year I got out of residential school, the year I got out of residential school was the first year The Simpsons appeared on TV. The last year, the last residential school closed. The movies that were in the theater at the time were Independence Day and Twister. And the Spice Girls released their first album. So when you hear, when it's something that's talked a lot about over the past little bit here, is this the role of the residential schools. What happened to us then? Like I said, when we asked for education, that's not what we meant. We did not mean take our children, put them into a situation where they would be physically, sexually, emotionally, and spiritually abused, and for many cases not come home. What we wanted was for our children to have the same opportunities as those living off reserve, out of our communities. And to this day, it's something we're still fighting. We're still, in many cases, we're still looking for that. And that's the thing. When treaties were made, those promises that were made in exchange for access to the land, a lot of it, we're still trying very hard as our leadership to get back, to ensure that these promises are made. And we're very lucky that we have our generations have been coming up and fighting for that. And I'm very honored that one of the first court cases ever to go before the Crown in terms of treaty land, the return of treaty land, was my great-grandfather, my chapan. His name was George Drever. And this old man, he was another one, he wasn't very tall. These short guys fought such hard battles. And in 1935, he succeeded in court. It was one of the first court cases to be successful. Some of the things that were promised in treaties was access to farming equipment. The government wanted us to give up the hunter-gatherer society, and they wanted us to be farmers. They wanted us to be, to join in this great, the great agricultural renaissance of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. They wanted us, this was the vision they had for us. They promised that they would provide plows, they would provide animals, they would provide seed. Many times that wasn't provided. And the rules were set up so that non-Indigenous farmers or Indigenous farmers could not sell at the same time. If you had a cow, if you were a non-Indigenous farmer and you had a cow and you wanted to sell it, you could go and sell it to anybody you wanted to. If you were, say, my great-grandfather, who was a farmer, if he had a cow, that cow had a brand on it that said ID, Indian Department. In order for him to even think about selling that cow, he had to go get permission from the Indian agent to say, can I sell my cow? Could I butcher my cow? You weren't even allowed to butcher your own animals if you were hungry. You had to get permission. And at the same time, when it was calving season, when the non-Indigenous farmers were allowed to go to market with their cattle, we weren't allowed. We had to wait until everybody's done, then we could go if they gave us permission. there were laws in place that we weren't allowed to leave the reserve. We weren't allowed to, unless we had a piece of paper, a pass, that said, this Indian's allowed to leave the reserve. And it literally said, this Indian. This is to certify that this Indian. And then there's a blank. You needed that. And in many places, that law is still on the books. The pass system was never taken off the books. So there are some places in this country where, as Indigenous people living off the reserve, we're in violation of the law. We are off reserve without permission. And that those laws are still on the books. It's an antiquated law that doesn't get enforced, but it's still there. When another one of the provisions of treaty was access to what they call the medicine chest. And this is where we kind of get into a weird area. There's a treaty right, and then there's what's called the spirit and intent of treaty. If you read the treaty, it says that all of Her Majesty said Red Indians, this is the wording of it, has the ability to access the medicine chest. Now, the spirit of intent of treaty means that we get to go to the doctor. We get to go visit the doctor. We get to go to hospital. The treaty right says we get to go visit, if there's a box of medicine on the reserve, and if you're sick, you can go take medicine out of that physical box. That's what it needed to be amalgamated and changed to that we could, go see the doctor. That's where this, all Indians get free healthcare. That was something I hear all the time. All you Indigenous people get free healthcare. Wow. There's universal healthcare. Everybody should get free healthcare. But what that entitles us, that a treaty right provides, is that we have access to medicines. We have access to care. But like I said, it's very bare bones. A current joke in our community right now, they're called Indian Affairs glasses. And if you go to the eye doctor and you got to pay for your, you go get your eye exam. If your health care coverage provides it, if your province pays for it, or if you got personalized health care coverage, they pay for that, you get your glasses. Well, for us to go to glasses, the glasses we're usually given are, like I said, the lowest of the cheapest ones you can find. And those are usually the great big, looking like that guy from Degrassi, the big 1980s square glasses. So those are in Moccasin country, it was called Indian Affairs glasses. And for a long time, that was all we could get, right up until a couple of years ago. That was what they would offer you. And here's my glasses. They're pretty big glasses. It's what we're offered. That even goes to right down to when we pass away. When we pass away, the funerals that were, the Department of Indian Affairs, well, whatever it's called now, INAC, or it's changed, the acronym's changed so many times. The coffins are given are very, they're small, the cheapest ones they can find. The lowest of the low, the cheapest of the cheap. So when we talk about these treaty rights, like I said, they're not always being honored. They're not, we entered into these agreements so that we would be equal partners. And when we say we are all treaty people, that means we are all equal partners. We are all on this equal playing field. We came and we provided access to this territory, this land. We gave up our ancestral right to walk this land. We gave up our ancestral right to go where we wanted, to follow our food supply, to conduct our ceremonies. And in exchange for that, all we wanted was to have the same opportunities in exchange, and provide for that. And in many cases, to this day, that's still not being provided. One of the treaty rights that is very important, and it's something that is very, very special to me, is we are exempt from something called conscription. As treaty people, we are exempt from being conscripted into what were called the Queen's Wars. So if war was declared and they were calling for soldiers and they were conscripting, drafting soldiers, we were exempt from that. That being said, Indigenous soldiers, Indigenous young men and women signed up and fought. Even to this day, they still sign up. I myself, I work with the Sea Cadets. I'm a civilian instructor. That step to honor that, when we signed those treaties, we signed them in that these are our partners. âpahkowâyânaw, the Queen, that's our partner. That's our grandmother. We're you know, that's our we're if she needs us, we'll help her out. I had 3 great uncles fight in the First World War. I had 2 of them fight at Vimy Ridge. I have 1 still at Vimy Ridge. They never found his body. My great uncle was a man named Joseph Drever. Joseph Drever won the military medal at Vimy Ridge. And when he came home in 1918 as a Canadian soldier, and this happened right across from the First World War to the Second World War to Korea. As a returning Canadian soldier, he would have been given land. He would have been entitled to land as a veteran. When he got home, and as every Indigenous soldier returned home, they were told, go see Indian Affairs. Now, you remember I was talking about how once upon a time, the only thing that separated Mistawasis and Muskeg was a barbed wire fence. In 1919, the Government of Canada came and started annexing reserve land and giving it to non-Indigenous soldiers. They were taking chunks of reserve land, First Nations land, and just giving it away to these soldiers, all non-Indigenous soldiers. The court case I mentioned in 1935 that my great-grandfather, my Chapan, fought, was part of that, to stop that. And while they were ruled in favor, it still continued. You move into the Second World War. My great uncle, Joseph, his son was named Sergeant Harvey Drever. He's believed to be the first Indigenous soldier to land on Juno Beach. He was with the Regina Rifles, and they figure he was one of the first soldiers out of one of the first landing crafts to land on Juno Beach. And he was killed overseas. My grandfathers, my step-grandfather, and my biological grandfather, Jim Brady, they were both veterans. And when you get into the Métis side of it, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. That's a long convoluted that we're still, that story's still being told, as is the one with Treaty. But I'll use my step grandfather for example. He wasn't like an 18-year-old kid when he landed. He was 38 years old when he landed at Juno Beach. He wasn't a wet behind the ears kid. He was a grown man. And he came from the Muscadet Cree Nation. At that time, it was called the John Smith Cree Nation. When he came home, he was told, and this was a man who, like I said, he was approaching 40, and he was part of the Canadians that entered Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp, and was part of the forces that went in and helped to liberate that camp. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. So this man went through a lot. When he came back, he wanted to be a farmer. What did he get told? Go talk to Indian Affairs. The land he was given was reserve land. It was land he was entitled to anyways. This carried right on into Korea. I tell a very sad story about somebody, and I always honor this man. I spent a lot of my career working street outreach in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, working with people on the street, young people on the street, homeless people. And there was this one man who was always, you never ran into him sober. It was his, that was his life was one of being intoxicated all the time. He was a homeless man. He was an older man. And on the one convert, every now and then you catch him sober, he'd sit and have a cup of coffee, and he looked at me one time and he says, "You know what, I'm a papered electrician or a papered engineer." Yeah, right. Sure you are. And I go, no. Open up his pocket and he pulled out this piece of paper. Old, ratty piece of paper. University of Saskatchewan. This is to certify that so-and-so has graduated with honors from the School of Engineering, dated 1954. He'd served in Korea. He'd fought in Korea. When he came back, he'd said, he talked to the veterans and he said, "Hey, I heard that if you serve, they'll pay for your university." And he goes, "Yep." Are you treaty? And he goes, "Yeah." "Oh, you're gonna have to give that up." There was a process called enfranchisement for many, many years. If an Indigenous person wanted to join the clergy, if an Indigenous person wanted to go to university, if they want to pursue a judicial career, if they want to pursue a medical career, a law enforcement career, any career, you had to give up your right to status. You give up the treaty. This man gave all that up, gave up his treaty rights to go become an engineer. He went through all that, got his paperwork. Nobody'd hire him because he was an Indigenous person. This is in the 1950s, 1960s. This was a highly trained engineer. Nobody would touch him because he was an Indigenous person. And this is something that carried on for years and years and years. Knowing all of this, knowing all these promises that were broken, that this, we never wanted to be seen as, helpless, helpless little waifs that needed the government to come pat our hand. No. This was all, we agreed, you promised us this in this signed document. We've held up our end of the bargain. It's time for you to hold up yours. And that has been the fight for so long. When we continue, when we talk and advocate for this, the reason we keep doing this is so that we can continue to say, we've held up our end. It's time for you to hold up yours. For myself, the role treaty and allyship has played for me has been very important. Like I said, as a residential school survivor, I've experienced firsthand a lot of what the colonization, the pain of that. I won't go into details because I'm pretty sure that you can draw your own conclusions what happened to us in there. What a lot of people, as Josh was talking about, mentioned recently in the news, when I was born, my name was John A. McDonald. That was my birth name. If anybody is not aware of the connotations of what that name means for as an Indigenous person, Sir John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada. Sir John A. Macdonald was also the instigator of the residential school system. To be an Indigenous survivor of residential schools, to be a survivor, to be an Indigenous person and carry that name has always been tough. When I would try to share my stories, people didn't believe me. They thought, you didn't, you're young. They would look at me, but you're white. They would say they didn't want it. And your name, they thought I was being funny. They thought I picked this name as kind of a joke. after 40 years of this, and as I was coming to be able to talk about my experiences in residential school, I knew I wanted to make a change. And this is where allyship comes into play. The government of Saskatchewan, the current incarnation of the government of Saskatchewan, and I have kind of been, it's never been the most positive of relationships, to put it that way, between Indigenous peoples and the provincial government. But one of the things that they did was they recently, last year, accepted one of the 92 call, or one of the calls to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was to provide the ability for those of us who survived residential schools, who had our names changed, which did happen. If they couldn't, my last name is McDonald. The reason our surname is McDonald is because when they put our names on the list, the treaty, the guy who was putting in the list couldn't pronounce their traditional family name. So he just basically said, well, you're McDonald now. And that's why he gave my ancestor that name. He just said, you're McDonald now. So for those of us who had that happen to us, or in terms of when you went into residential school with a traditional name and they took that from you, which happened lots too, you could go and get your name changed with the cost being reimbursed. When I first heard about that process, I said, yeah, this is something I want to do. It's long enough, it's time. And this was around the time when all the statues of John A. Macdonald were coming down. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is a very wonderful organization that helps us as survivors. And there's a man there named Eugene Arcan, who's with the Survivor Circle. Eugene went to the same residential school that my father went to, which was St. Michael's, Duck Lake. And when I approached him, I said, I would like to change my name. I gave him my story. Would you help me with this? And he said, absolutely. And we had a lot of people on that end who helped us out. That step, being able to do that, was just one small part of showing allyship in terms of what the government provided. It's not, in the grand scheme of things, could they be doing more? Oh yeah. But it's something, every little step forward counts. And when we talk about those calls, those Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls, when that happened, when they said these are a list of things you could do, so many people would read them and just kind of dismiss them. Oh, we can't do this, too much. Oh no, we can't do that. Oh, if we do this, it's going to offend these guys. Or I've watched people pick those apart, and if you look at them, they are not hard. This is not a hard step to follow. They're in the grand scheme of things, they're baby steps. In my role as senator of QP Saskatchewan in the Indigenous Council Committee, one of my roles was to break down how we could implement those truth and reconciliation calls into the workplace, into the work as a union, into our workplaces, and go beyond just a simple land acknowledgement, go beyond wearing orange shirts. What could we honestly do? And a lot of that was just breaking down, sitting with non-Indigenous people and breaking down a lot of the myths and stereotypes and explaining what these meant. And breaking down these myths. Oh, well, you guys never pay income tax. Well, yeah, I do. Here is my form. I live off reserve. I pay income tax. I pay into this. Look at, you can see it, and showing that. And where that misconception comes that we don't pay taxes comes from the fact that on reserve, if you look at the names, Muskeg Lake, First Nation, Atakaku, Cree Nation, Peter Ballantyne, Cree Nation. That word, nation. Those, if you look at the way when treaties were signed, those were signed between two sovereign nations, us as Indigenous people and the Crown and the Dominion of Canada. So we came to it not as big brother and little little one. No. We came as, this is a nation. This is a nation. We're coming together to meet, to sign that treaty, to sign that between us as partners. When people say, oh, you guys are get things tax free. No, we don't pay if it's on reserve land. Technically, that's not Canadian soil. That's a First Nation. So we can't charge, it'd be like somebody coming up to you from Germany and saying, okay, we got to pay German taxes on that. Or, somebody from the States, coming and saying, you got to pay, American taxes on Canadian soil. A lot of these myths and misconceptions need to be broken down. That's where things like this, talking about them, sharing them, is very important. And it's a fight we still continue to this day. Recently, I won't say recently, about 20, 25 years ago, in the grand scheme of things, recently, many First Nations groups began something called Treaty Land Entitlement. Now, what Treaty Land Entitlement was if you looked at the treaties, they actually promised X amount of square kilometers of land for these specific First Nations. And what happened was we were either not given that land, or like what happened after the war, that land was taken. And so the agreement that we came up with the government was that the government would provide the money for First Nations to purchase the land that was originally promised us. And in many cases, what happened was, and this is something I'm as a member of Muskeg, I'm very proud of. In many cases, what would happen was, I think the expectation was, well, we're going to give the money to these First Nations, and they're just going to buy the land around around the reserves, buy up the farmland. Muskeg Lake, my community, my home territory, did something pretty cool. They were the first First Nation in Saskatchewan, maybe even Canada, to do this. They took that treaty land entitlement money, and instead of investing it in farmland adjacent to the reserve, they bought land in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. They bought land in the city of Saskatoon and established the first at the time it was called the first Indian Urban Reserve. Now it's the first urban reserve. So if you ever go to Saskatoon and you go up to a place called âpahkowâyânaw Avenue, and you see where Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Authority is, and where Creeway Gas is, and all these, that land is all, that's urban reserve land. And it started a precedent where that land, generates revenue for the communities. And you'll find in many communities, particularly in Saskatchewan here, you'll go to communities where there'll be an Aboriginal owned and Indigenous owned gas station. And that's a case where the gas, if you're an Indigenous person, you got that treaty card, you get your gas because they're not paying Canadian taxes on that, because technically that little chunk of land is reserve land. And when we're in the grand scheme, people say, well, you're getting all this stuff for free. It's like 25 cents on the tank of gas. That's about it. I got more in my pocket right now than it's costing the Canadian taxpayer in terms of, and I think I got maybe 75 cents in my pocket right now. So this myth that we get all this stuff for free is one of the things we got to break down. Well, we've made many steps forward. There are many steps that are going backwards. And this is what I want to talk about right now is January 1st, 2022, the Government of Saskatchewan instituted a law to provide landowners, private landowners, with more rights to trespassing laws on their property. It's to prohibit, in order for you, if you suspect as a landowner of somebody trespassing on your property, you have the right to prosecute this person. You can contact the law, and it's a big thing. They've been stepping, and it's increased and strengthened trespassing laws in our area. This was done. This law came about in the shadow of what happened to Colton Boushie. For those not familiar with what happened to Colton Boushie was a 22-year-old man from the Red Pheasant First Nation, who was brutally killed by a non-Indigenous farmer, shot in the head, and the farmer was found not guilty because of the all-white jury believed that he was defending himself. Colton Boushie was still in the car, was still buckled into the seat of his car and was shot. And it created a lot of racial tension that still exists in Saskatchewan. As an Indigenous person in Saskatchewan, particularly in rural Saskatchewan where I live, it is the climate is very scary. Where I live, I'm in a rural setting, within 5 kilometers of a First Nation, of the Little Red First Nation. Anything that happens in this area of a criminal nature gets blamed on the natives. The natives did this. The natives stole my car. Every time. And this is something that happens across Saskatchewan. I'm pretty sure, I can almost guarantee that it probably happens across Alberta and Manitoba too. If you're a rural community within driving distance of a First Nation, that the majority of the issues that happen in your community get blamed on the natives. What this trespassing law that came about, one of the rights that we have as Indigenous people is the right to hunt for sustenance, hunt for ourselves to eat, to survive. I am a hunter. I'm a sustenance hunter. I hunt to provide for my family. Prior to this law, I could, if a land was not marked no trespassing, I was okay to hunt on a land, Crown land. I could, the land that is held in trust by the Queen that's considered Crown land, that we're able to hunt on there to sustenance hunt, to hunt for our survival. What this new trespassing law does, it states that if I, as a hunter, if I say I was hunting on a field and I shot a deer and that deer crossed into a no trespassing line, I would have to go and find whoever's land that was. I could be out in the middle of nowhere. I'd have to go find whoever's land is, get written permission, and come all the way back to go find that deer. And that hunter and that landowner has every right to say, no, you can't. That also goes for medicine picking. If I, as a medicine person, was to go pick medicine, I need permission, and that person has every right to say no, even though for thousands of years, my people have picked medicine there, and I might have had permission to do that. And while it might seem like, well, somebody once said, well, when this law comes in, they're not really going to be that bad. I'm going to share a story that's kind of painful for me to share, and if I can share it without crying, the day Colton Boushie, or the day his killer, I won't even want to mention his name, was found not guilty. It was on the front page of the Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Not guilty, it said. I was in a gas station, and my kids were in the car, and I was getting gas. And there was a guy at the till, and I knew him from, he's a neighbor. And it's a person I'd walked across his land lots. I'd gotten permission for that. And I said, hey, I'm tracking this animal. Yeah, go ahead. And my kids are in the car. He points at the paper, and he says, well, better hope your car doesn't break down on my property, eh? He said it as a joking. He's trying to be funny. And there's my kids. I'm looking over at my kids. If I had a car, and if I had my children in the car and we stalled in the property, it was this, and this is the guy, this guy's joking about. It's a scary time. It's a scary time for us as Indigenous people, because it's not just a matter of somebody being inconvenienced. It's not just a matter of somebody being, oh, well, yes, I have to go get this. It could be a matter of life and death, because you don't know. Person could be fine one day, and it goes with saying it could happen to anybody, but it's something that is, when we're looking for allies, when we're looking for people that we can be comfortable around, we're worried that we're not going to get killed by. It's a scary thing. And this new law that comes into effect, that came into effect January 1st, severely inhibits that ability for us as people of treaty to exercise our treaty rights, to exercise our right to be able to go collect, not only to be able to go collect medicine or to go hunt, but just to be out in nature and not worry about getting killed. And unfortunately, precedent's been set where in a situation like that, the favor is going to go to the side of the non-Indigenous farmer with the gun. That being said, what could allies do? What allies can do is use privilege. As a non-Indigenous person, you have a privilege that we as Indigenous people often don't. When a non-Indigenous person can speak passionately, can stand up and share, you're seen as somebody who is really caring. You're seen as somebody who is passionate. As Indigenous people, if we get passionate about something, if we try to our best to become emotionally attached, we're the angry Indian. The natives are restless, we get told. The natives are on the war path, we get told, and we get dismissed as the angry Indian. Oh, the Indians are angry again. I hear that all the time. And this is 2022, and I still hear people using that term, the Indians, the Indians, the Indians, and using those terminologies of Indians on the war path. As non-Indigenous allies, using that privilege of being able to get passionate and emotional about something is it's powerful medicine. It's medicine that you possess, that you can take that for that moment, take that space and call somebody out. If you hear somebody engaging in racist talk or dismissive talk, that's a huge thing. That's huge, powerful medicine to be able to say, whoa, wait a minute, hold up. As allies, another amazing, just doing this, just listening to Indigenous people share their stories, just listening and coming not as a matter of tokenism, not as a matter of, oh, I want to make sure I'm on the right side of this. Oh, as a matter of, and going to be an honest person, not going there to take a selfie. Hey, it's me at the protest, right? But coming to it as an honest and an honest effort to connect and say, hey, I want to help. And being there in an honest effort to help is a huge, huge thing. Education. That's one thing that Chief Mistoasis, he when he signed treaties, he said education he's one of the chiefs that said education is the new buffalo. Educate yourself. Continue to provide that opportunity to learn. We're always learning. From the moment we're born, we learn. We learn how to take that first breath. We learn how to cry. We learn where our mom is. Right to the moment at the end, we're learning how to die. That's a learning experience to go, and all of it is learning, taking in as much knowledge as you can. I often get called a knowledge. I'm not quite an elder. I'm not that old yet, I don't think. I've often been called a knowledge keeper, and I don't like that term. For an Indigenous culture, knowledge keepers and elders are held in very high regard. And you never call yourself, you never refer to yourself as, I'm an elder, I'm a knowledge keeper, because that's a title that's given to you. That's not one you take on yourself. That's a title that's given to you. And when people have tried to give me that title of knowledge keeper, I often say, but I'm not keeping this knowledge. I'm not keeping it to myself. I'm carrying it for a while. I'm carrying it to pass it on. And part of that role, I much prefer that term knowledge carrier. I'm just carrying it from the person who gave it to me to pass it on to the next person. And that gift, that sharing. In Cree, the term for teacher is kisnamagyo. But that doesn't translate into a teacher. That translates, the literal translation would be something more along the lines of, I'm showing this to you so that you can use it. And that's part of what this is. And as allies, and that continuing to take the knowledge that we share and offer, and to use it not in a way to exploit, but in a way to help, to heal. There's a lot of healing we got to do yet. There's a lot of healing. We've come a long way, but it is something that, oh, sorry, my dog's barking. We got a long way to go. But the fact that we're still going on that journey is powerful, that we haven't, I often said that sometimes it's heavy on the heart to know that I'm fighting the same battle my grandfather fought, and my great-grandfather fought, and my great-great-grandfather fought, in many generations. And sometimes it weighs upon you. But there are moments where you kind of go, you get these little sparks. Yesterday, my nephew, his partner, had their first child, and I was stopping to think about that. I went to residential school. Both my sisters went to residential school. Both my parents went to residential school. My grandparents went to residential school. All uncles and aunties on both sides went to residential school. My children and my nephew's generation are the first generation in 4 to have never known the inside of a residential school. That was a cycle we broke. And when that child was born yesterday, that's another generation that's never going to know they're never going to have that experience as part of the, it's going to be part of who they are, but it's not going to be the overriding factor. And that's one thing that, as a survivor, it's something that I understand. My generation of residential school survivors, at one of these days, we're going to be the last generation who've had firsthand knowledge of what went on, who have firsthand knowledge being in them buildings. And it's something where we don't take lightly. And we don't take it lightly for a very important reason. A lot of what gets shown about what happened back then, you get black and white photographs of ancient photographs of what happened in the 40s and the 50s and 60s. And it kind of paints it like it was long ago. And it's not that long ago. Like I said, the last residential school closed in 1996. I got out in 1989. So that's not that long. That's, if I remember seeing Independence Day in the theaters. I remember when NSYNC came, their first album came out. Friends was in season 3 of the last residential school closed. So it, to know that my nephew's little boy there, he's coming into a world that while he might still have to fight this fight, he's going to do it knowing that he is part of a generation that broke a cycle, that his father came from a generation that broke a cycle. And I'm hoping that what we share here today, that the medicine I've shared today, the information I've shared today, that you help and you could share it to someone, and you could continue and provide that teaching to somebody else, and continue to, like I said, call out when you see it happening. And you learn and look for certain things. As Indigenous people, are the reason we're still here is that we have the ability to take what has happened to us over the years, and instead of letting us beat it down, we've fallen back upon our resilience of surviving. Like I said, it was minus 50 here. Yes, last week. And it was minus 50 when my ancestors were walking before the time we had horses and we were living off the land. It was minus 50 then too. If they had given up back then, I wouldn't be here. And so that resilience that we have, we take, and when we see the world around us, we take it in. And we hopefully we could take those teachings that we're given every day and share them. And every that's one thing that the elders always said to me was, there's no such thing as a good thing or a bad thing. They just are. They're things that happen. It's the lesson you learn or the lesson you don't learn which makes something good or bad. When you're a child and you touch a hot stove, you're either going to learn, oh yeah, or you're going to be that one kid who goes, oh, oh, oh. So hopefully when we share these words and when you're listening to these words, that if you do touch a stove and burn, you learn not to go, oh, oh, oh. And that when you take these words and you share them, that you're helping somebody else along the way, and continuing on that cycle of healing. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to Nanaskompton. I know Josh wanted to save some time for some Q&A, so that's it.
Yeah, no, that was wonderful, and a lot of great information that you shared there, John. And really, I just find a very important perspective that you shared during this talk. Yeah, very powerful, as people have said, and very personal, of course, to your own personal journey and to your community and family journey, and a lot of things that definitely I can relate to just with my own upbringing, and having also that connection of having that family, trying to break that cycle of having family members who have been in the residential school system, and just going back to being proud of who we are in that regard. And funny enough too, it was the whole thing, like, how like INAC changes their titles and stuff like that. I went to one session with a government worker, and he was telling me that INAC's like The Walking Dead, where he could change the names as many times, but it will always be INAC pretty much. And I just found it I just was like, absolutely. I found it kind of hilarious. Then also interesting that it's coming from a government worker in that regard. But it was just that's one thing that definitely popped up in my head. And even too, like when you thought about how, like when you said that, how we are fighting the same battles that pretty much our ancestors are fighting, it does hold a lot of power and weight to it, because I think even just on the Métis side of things, going back to the Battle of Cuthbert Grant, flying into the Métis flag and just trying to let people know this is who we are as a people, many times that's just still what we as Indigenous people are fighting for. And that was 150 so years ago in that sense, and we're still having that battle today in that case. So no, I want to thank you very much for coming and sharing your just your perspective, your knowledge. I even like that how you said it's that's the thing, we're not keeping the knowledge, we're holding it, and just so we can pass it down, and continue to pass it down, because of course all the knowledge that we share, it comes from somewhere. It's not as if we've just written it out of thin air, in that sense. It's not that easy, sadly, in that regard. With our people, they've put in the work to pass it down in that case. So I really appreciated how you shared that too. We can definitely get into some questions too. We have two questions that I've seen written, and then, or we might have three actually, but the first one I have is from Elisa Richards, and she's asking, what are tools you use to break through cognitive dissonance? That was an interesting question.
That is the one thing that you, when trying to break through that, is trying very hard not to get angry, and trying not to there's that old adage of, you can try talking to a brick wall, but it's still gonna, it's gonna be a brick wall. It is very tough to break through that when you've got the society just saying, we'll get over it. When you get it's been so long, it's been, you're constantly dealing with the denial of what happened and stuff. In terms of tools, it's going back to that, just understanding that when you're trying to share, are you sharing from a point of, are you trying to prove this person wrong, or are you trying to share and educate? And that's a very important lesson. Are you going into this argument, this verbal joust, to make to prove this person wrong and to make yourself feel better, or out of a sense of, out of a real sense of trying to educate this person? And that's probably the biggest tool that I have, is doing that momentary check. Okay, where am I coming from with this? Is this going to be am I just doing this for my own or am I doing it for, well, no, I really want this person to notice, and knowing when to say, okay, you know what, I've given what I can to this conversation, and any more is starting to drain me, and knowing when to walk away. And that's a point where, when you see something in a situation, particularly online, where you're seeing somebody doing that, and you can, it's so hard to get that emotional context through text and through, but if you can honestly, you can sense when a person is when a person, and I'll use an Indigenous person for example, when they're finally starting to get worn down, that'd be a perfect opportunity for an ally to kind of tag in and carry on that. There used to be a hashtag where you could go hashtag settler collector. And when you were dealing with somebody who was just so stubborn, and just would not, and was just, was a keyboard warrior who was just there. In Cree, we call them macha, evil spirits. When you're just dealing with somebody you just don't know, and you would just type that in and somebody would jump in. I don't know if that happens anymore. But that's the big thing, is understanding, why am I this fight? Is it to make me feel better, or is it to honestly carry that? And that's one thing. If you ever have a chance to listen to Indigenous elders speak, you'll notice they'll say something. There's this great big long pregnant pause. Then they'll say something else. Another great big long pregnant pause. What that elder's doing is they're thinking about every word that's about to come out of their mouth. And your thoughts are your thoughts. You can think whatever you want. And this is the way an elder described it to me. You could think about pushing somebody down a flight of stairs. They're your thoughts. But the minute those words leave your mouth, or those actions, you take responsibility for them, what they cause. And that's what that elder, when they talk, is they are thinking about every single word, because whatever they say, they have to take responsibility for. And how is the person going to receive what I'm saying? How are these people, when I see these words, what are they going to do with these words? And so that's part of that taking that moment. And when you see, that's where that understanding is, why am I saying this? And because it in the heat of the moment, you can just get going, and all of a sudden you're just, and then you lose track of it, and then all of a sudden you've lost that focus. And that's staying, why am I saying this? Am I saying this to be right, or am I saying this to teach?
That was a good response. No, I definitely, I can relate to that too, just in the sense, picking and choosing your battles, very, very important when it comes to that. And absolutely doing it in the sense of, we want to educate people. If we have to get down to their level, we will do it. And if we both rise up at the same kind of, we're on the same path in that sense, we're not disturbing each other, we're walking both as allies. There's a lot of value to that. Absolutely. So no, that was a really great way of putting it, John. Betty was asking, how does your community feel about the payout? I think what she's talking about, she has it worded as, how does your tribe feel about the payout from the Canadian government? So I don't know if that specifically refers to, I don't know specifically what Betty's referring to specifically, if it's just how payments are still handled from the federal government to Indigenous communities, or if it's the payout. I know there was one through the residential schools too that was done through the payout through. So it might be that one too. That might be what she's referring to.
Um, I think it would be a lot easier if we didn't have to keep going through court in order to get them.
Yeah.
uh, and this is something where I can only speak for myself on this one, but this nation is not by any means an impoverished nation. There is enough resources in this country in terms of monetary resources and intangible ones to provide for, you know, all the different factions that certain powers that be like to keep fighting amongst each other. There's enough resources in this country to provide people with a way to live for Indigenous people, for the homeless, for veterans, for newcomers, for refugees, for the addicted, for those coming out of correctional systems, for those below poverty, for those who have no drinking water. There are enough resources in this country to provide and more. I don't know why a lot of people like to keep people fighting amongst each other all the time, trying to say, well, why are we taking in this people when we got these people that we need to fix? Or why are we giving money for these people when we should be doing? There's enough to go around. It's greed and NIMBY and and xenophobia and this selfishness that keeps people kind of wanting to faction people off. And for me, that's the hurtful thing, is that we have to keep fighting so hard, all aspects, not just Indigenous people, but people on the streets, newcomers to this country, people who are fleeing war-torn countries, people who don't have drinking water, people coming out of the joint who have, who are struggling, people with addictions. There's enough. We have enough in this country to provide for everybody. It's the selfishness that we got to get over in this. We got to hoard everything. And going back to my culture, they used to say on our reserve, the way you could spot the leader's house on a reserve was it was the poorest house on a reserve, because everything he had was for the people. And we've kind of lost that. And now it's judged, in various, not just in Indigenous communities, but in general, the leadership they live in be it business, be it finance, be it wherever, in politics, great big mansions. Well, there are people who are suffering. It's painful.
And I know, like, the interesting thing in Edmonton too is how some of the neighborhoods here around the river where there are mansions, those used to be where the river lots were, where Métis people used to live, right? So it's interesting to see that. Like, you just look at the whole contrast in general. Very interesting. Clint has a question, which might even lead to a kind of a conversation around the whole thing around what we call unceded land, even in that regard, and that whole conversation around that. But Clint is saying, sorry if I misunderstood you, but I'm wondering if you were saying that the Crown owns all the land because we agreed to only live on our own little piece of land called a reserve. And that's Clint has it as written as a question.
So Crown land is something that is kind of held in by both provincial and federal governments. It's land that is used for I'll use Northern Saskatchewan. We have the provincial forest, the Northern Provincial Forest. It's land that is held by the government. It's not sold. It's not used. It's just basically the government's holding on to it. When you get into unceded territory, you hear this a lot, particularly in BC. That is land that was never surrendered by treaty. When you hear in a land acknowledgement where somebody's referring to unceded territory, that was land where treaties were never signed, and those groups never entered into treaty with either the Crown or the Canadian government. And you have in those, particularly like, for example, what's happening on the West Coast right now with the Wet'suwet'en, that's territory that has been occupied by that group since time immemorial. And at no point has any of that land ever been given as a treaty's never been signed. The government's never been brought in to take part, take quote unquote ownership of that land. So when you have, in terms of Crown land as opposed to unceded territory, so that's the land that the government kind of has taken as part of that treaty, those treaty negotiations, that the government said, well, this is kind of the territory that we want, and the reserve land is kind of what we were promised. But the unceded territory, that has never been signed by treaty. That's those territories have never been, a treaty's never been brokered between the First Nations and either the Crown or the government.
Yeah, and I think too, just looking back to how you mentioned like previously, how like from the Canadian government Western kind of worldview on treaties, it was always viewed as a way of attaining land and resources, versus for us, we were always thinking more, how can the future generations actually survive and prosper? Because look at kind of the way that we're living in that regard. And that's kind of the one thing that's always kind of been missed from the Canadian side in that sense. They never really viewed it as a way for, okay, how are both parties actually going to prosper? It's always been kind of, oh, this is a way for us to attain, once again, more land and more. And, there's so much more on top of it, like with the Métis side, with Métis script and that kind of stuff. And just the whole, like, there's so much layers to it in that regard. But yeah, I think that was a good explanation.
And even going back to, if I could interject, back to
absolutely.
Particularly your neck of the woods, this ties into my family too. There was at one time, there was a reserve just north of where Edmonton is now called âpahkowâyânaw. Chief âpahkowâyânaw was a great friend of my grandfather Laurent Garneau, and they when my great grandfather was actually imprisoned for treason for being a confidant to Riel, my great grandmother and her children were taken in by Chief âpahkowâyânaw, and Chief âpahkowâyânaw, they signed treaty, and that was a reserve, and they got kind of swindled out of their reserve and got told, okay, well, you're Métis now, and had their treaty rights kind of taken, and that reserve just annulled basically and vanished. At that time, when the community of St. Paul de Métis was created, âpahkowâyânaw actually came, and he, my great grandfather Laurent Garneau remembered how Chief âpahkowâyânaw took in my great grandmother and her children when he was in jail. He brought them and he said, "You can come stay with us." And so that's another way of a lot of what happened. It was not a unique thing that people that were treaty lost a lot of their treaty rights, particularly after the 1885 uprising. You had a lot of bands that were considered disloyal to the Crown, and they lost treaty rights. Even some members of Muskeg Lake, my own community, lost treaty rights because of their participation in the uprising. So.
Yeah, no, and even with one of my ancestors, Julia Boucher, she's one of my great grandmothers. She has on her script paper, it specifically says ceases to be an Indian on it, and then they gave her script. So it was in Alberta, it was I find very common. They get very much the treaty commissioners and the script commissioners, they were co-workers, like, to really just kind of summarize it in that sense. So a lot of times they were working together on what Canada had planned in that case.
Somebody described it one time, they say that the whole script system was the biggest game of Monopoly ever played. So,
yeah.
And that the scripts, if you held up a piece of Métis script, it had the same monetary value as like Boardwalk and Park Place. In the name of the game, it means lots, but away from the game, it's just a piece of paper. So.
Yeah. No, exactly right. And no, it's just, yeah, I could totally see just that correlation there. So no, thank you for sharing that. Um, Betty, I don't know, like, you must be from, are you from the United States? You're asking, are there reservations in Canada? So yes, the reservations, they're called reserves, but also too, I'm sure they like to call them First Nation communities also too, in that regard. But yeah, they're called reserves in that case, and they're located all across Canada, pretty much. I think every province and territory has what you could consider an Indigenous community in that case. And I don't know, I don't know if there are, like, yeah, I just don't know the full, like, I don't know if there are there reserves in the Northwest Territories and like Yukon, and I don't know about Nunavut. Hey.
I don't in First Nations there are, particularly Yukon, Northwest Territories. When you start getting into Nunavut, there might be, I don't know if they're structured in the same way as
Mhm.
in the reserve system.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. So
but I
yeah,
know you go into northern you go into the northern BC, into the Yukon, you get into places like the Dog Rib and the
mhm.
different parts of north of 60, as it were.
Yeah, and like I even know the Northwest Territories, you follow that Mackenzie River, there's First Nation communities, lots of those communities along there. Actually, the thing in the Northwest Territory too is the Métis. They're considered under a treaty that they signed up there, and so that also throws another thing into it, because some people will say, well, Métis aren't treaty and that kind of stuff, and it's like, well, unless you're from the Northwest Territories in some
Yeah.
cases, right? And so it's just, yeah, no, it's quite interesting. A lot of people have really great comments too to share. Someone even said, someone brought up Frank Oliver too. Yeah, Frank Oliver was not a friendly person in any ways, and as you say, yeah, help get rid of Poppy Chase and Michelle First Nation. You were right on that. He was
He's
uh
kind of
I always say his number, like if he lived today, it would have been like 1-800 land swindle or something like that. That would be like his phone number pretty much. Because like, just, yeah. But a lot of people have a lot of great comments. Someone said, need to head out. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for your time and story. Powerful. I hope to hear more from you if other opportunities come up. Someone was saying thank you, deep gratitude, and deep gratitude for all the learning and hearing your knowledge, experience, and wisdom. Lots of comments like that. Someone even said on, I think your response on how to approach people, if you like with that argument, in that sense, someone is saying that's a really good point. I find myself arguing with people who say offhandedly racist things until I'm so angry I'm in tears, but stepping away might actually prove a point better. And yeah, that's honestly it. A lot of times you're actually in power of like the interaction happening, because the person who's saying that, they're trying to get something out of you, that reaction, and if you don't give that to them, a lot of times that will surprise them, and it keeps you in power of that conversation. And walking away, stepping away is one way to do that, absolutely. So yeah, no, that's great. I'm thankful to have finally learned these stories. Just lots of people very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing. My heart and head are changed for the good. Lisa says, Kinesko Matin, Mr. High. Ake, how would you say that? Ake Memok?
Akayememok.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey.
And Stephanie, I can't even imagine your ancestors. I can't even imagine your ancestors are so proud of you. Thank you for taking the time to share. Just lots of, yeah, very nice. I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of this afternoon for just, yeah, spending the time with me and John, and hearing what John has to say specifically, with his journey, and with his connection too with just the historic treaties here, in that regard. Thank you so much for sharing. That's so powerful and spiritual. Thank you so much for presenting. John, if I want to share your idea about knowledge carrier, how would you like to be referenced?
Gently. I guess that's I've been called a knowledge carrier, and that's something that I've been that's been given to me. So it's how that person, I can't say you can call me this. That's up to that person. So that's why, if they're gonna, gently, I guess.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing, right? I always say, like, if you do, like, if I am ever mentioned, I always make sure that when I go out and talk, and you do the same way, it always comes from somewhere, whether it's like, I spent time with this elder, my cookum shared this to me. This is what my great uncle did, or my great grandfather was doing during this time. It always comes from some place in that regard. And interesting enough, I watched a documentary recently, just quickly. It was about yoga, funny enough, but if you actually go to India, a lot of times they'll say things similar about yoga, how they'll never put their first name in front and claim they've created the yoga, because they say it's come and it's been passed down through their culture and community. And some people, they might think like, what does that mean? But for us, when I heard that, I was like, it totally makes sense. It's just, it's part of their culture. Someone was asking, are you a speaker for the Forward Summit in Calgary?
Not yet.
If they need one, though, definitely get them to reach out. Would I use John Brady McDonald, or do you have a name in your language you would prefer to use?
At this stage, I go by John Brady McDonald. I honor my middle name comes from my grandfather, Jim Brady, who is if people aren't familiar with who Jim Brady was, he was one of the greatest Métis leaders in the 20th century. In many Métis eyes, he's kind of held up there with Riel and Dumont for the role he played in striving for Métis people, for those. He was part of the committee that created the Métis Association of Alberta, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. He was a very powerful, influential Métis leader, and so when going forward, since I've changed my name, I always make sure that now that I have a name I can be proud of, I always make sure that I carry that. So John Brady McDonald is the way to go forward with that.
Awesome. Yeah, and even in Jean Taille's book, she worded it really well, how it's like you had, Cuthbert Grant, that time, then you had Louis Riel, and she really keyed, the Jim Brady era as like, that was kind of the next step and next level for the Métis Nation, was that path that, Jim Brady set forward. So no, it's very, very beautiful of you honoring your ancestor, or your grandfather rather, that way. Jamie Simmons is asking, I've read a lot of tradition and languages. I've read that a lot of tradition and languages have been lost through residential schools and other cruel laws. What was the process for you both learning your ancestry?
For me, learning, I didn't get back to the Red Road until I was 16 years old. When I went to residential school, we were punished for speaking Cree. I remember in preschool, that was when my first day of preschool. I was 4 years old, and I think I'd said to another kid, "Stum, come here," and the teacher spun me around, and I was 4 years old, and I remember being told that I wasn't to talk that gibberish in our classroom, that I was supposed to start talking right, and that if I continued to talk that gibberish, I was going to stay in recess. This is my first day preschool, first day of school ever, and that's that. It started quite early on, that removal of our culture for a large chunk of the 20th century. Indigenous cultures were banned, were outlawed in this country. You were not allowed to on the West Coast. You were not allowed to have potlatch. You were not allowed to have. You were not allowed to have the drum. You're not allowed to have feathers. You're not allowed to have sweat lodges. It for me to get back to that, it took a lot of. I went down a very, very dark road in my teens, battling substance abuse, battling homelessness, my addictions, and it wasn't until I attended a cultural school. I dropped out of high school, and the first person to set me back on my trail was a teacher who unfortunately we lost last year, a man by the name of Mr. Victor Thunderchild. He was a high school Cree teacher at the high school that I dropped out of. And unfortunately, we lost him last year to COVID-19. He was the first teacher in Saskatchewan to lose his life due to COVID-19. He himself faced the same, prejudices and stereotypes growing up. The funny thing is we were growing up, you get punished for being Indigenous, for being for having cultural practices, but at the same time, those same teachers if it was a hot day in August and it was a dry, they'd look at you and say, well, why don't you do a little round dance or a rain dance? So, you know, you have, at one hand, they're punishing you for being Indigenous. At the same time, they're mocking and belittling your culture. And so he was the first person to invite me back to the, you know, I was this long-haired guy in a black leather jacket and a Slayer t-shirt, with just a bad attitude walking down always. And he looked at me and says, come here. And I thought I was in trouble. He says, come with me. So we walked, and there was a drum. And he sat down, he put the drumstick in my hand, and I haven't left that drum since. And so in his last year of life, he was able to institute, our school division instituted one of the first Cree immersion kindergarten classes in our province. And I got a chance to talk to him a week before he passed away, and he was a dear friend and a mentor. And I got to spend some time in that classroom as an educational associate. And I got a chance to thank him. I said, you know what, 35 years ago, I was in a kindergarten class being punished for being an Indigenous person. And to be able to walk into a classroom and have little 5-year-old kids come up to me and in Cree go, you know, teacher, can you help me? And I spent that whole day just bawling. And, you know, I said, I got a chance to say, you know what, thank you. You know, that's another cycle broken. So it took that long for me to break that cycle of that, you know, being able to regain that culture. And it took, it was something where it wasn't forced upon me. It was something that that I chose to seek out. And that's one thing with my own children. The one thing a lot of people would expect as an Indigenous person, as a cultural person, is that my children would follow the same path. And you know, I'd be teaching my children. And I said no. And they said, well, why not? I said, I know what it's like to have somebody try force a culture upon you. I said, I'm not going. I've experienced that. I'm not going to do that with my culture to my children. When they want to, if that's the path they want to walk, then they can come and approach. And I've given them the tools to do that. And I explained to them, and then we sat down and had that chat. I said, I'm not going to force you to do this, because I know what it's like to have somebody force a culture upon you. Even though it's our own culture, I wouldn't want to do that to somebody. And so they every now and then they'll approach me, and they'll give them little cultural teachings. But I'm not going to, you know, make them, you know, you have to do this. You have to. I know what that feels like. I don't want to do that to anybody else. So that's part of that is that approaching it, because in myself I want to, and I'm very, very fortunate that I had that ability to do that. There are many in our society that don't have that luxury, that do not have that connection to culture, do not have that connection to elders. And the elders that taught me are all gone now. The elders that taught me, the elders that I got my lessons from, and all matriarchs, they were all female elders, because there were not the elders, the male elders that were around at the time, I didn't have access to. So my elders, the teachings I got as a medicine person, as a storyteller, and in this role that people have given me as a knowledge carrier, come from female elders. In particular, the late Vicky Wilson and the late Rita Pronto, who are powerful, well-recognized elders in my community. And so those teachings that they gave me, I continue forward.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, even from my own perspective, I mean, I'd be more, of course, on the intergenerational kind of side of things, just because my aunts and uncles, they went to residential school. My grandma, she surprisingly went to one of the early public schools in Calgary in the 1930s. We have a great grandmother that was Danish. So we believe that she was the one that handled the schooling when she was around, and my Métis great grandfather kind of probably stayed away when it came to that. And then my great grandfather, though, he was in residential school in that regard. But with my family, like I was kind of raised like we always knew Métis, like being Métis. Like I did jigging as a young age, being around elders and community leaders in that case. My grandma being very well connected in the community too, just learning a lot from her in that case. One thing though, of course, that was missing was the language part of it, though. We didn't really speak the language at all. And now it's been really just in the last, I would say like 3 years or so that I've been really kind of taking a steadfast into the Michif language and even other languages too, like Cree, and just other Indigenous languages that were spoken in this area. And for me, like through high school and junior high, I definitely felt a bit where, I didn't necessarily want it to be forced like in that way as kind of you were wording it. And kind of for me, I wanted to approach it in kind of a natural way when I wanted to come back to it. And I think too, kind of when you said that, that's us also kind of breaking away from that colonial kind of ways of like it has to be forced, it has to be taught, like even in the way it's taught, like it has to be taught in this kind of way specifically. I think it's us breaking away and actually going back to how things were historically and traditionally in that case. Like I always think like, okay, learning language, like if I went back, in the old days, like learning language, you would have learned that if you were out medicine picking, if you were out hunting, if you were spending day with Cookum in that sense, like everything was so naturally ingrained. And now we're trying to kind of get back to that, I find, in that regard. So no, once again, just thank you so much for sharing that and your journey. And I think everyone is very much appreciated on just your vulnerability too that you bring. I find that's one thing us as Indigenous peoples, when we come and share our perspectives, we put ourselves kind of in a vulnerable place. Of course, interesting enough, we're kind of used to that because, oftentimes we are sharing our stories, quite a bit in that case, which is good. People are listening. But just that always acknowledging that I do understand that you do put yourself, us as Indigenous people, we do put ourselves in a vulnerable place when we do come and share our stories. So just thanking you on your openness and willingness to share the knowledge that you have been, that have been passed to you and that you are passing to the future generations. In that case, I want to thank you personally. And another comment too from Stephanie too. Thank you so much, John and Josh. Really grateful for both of you for you and the information you shared today. That she's also was replying to what you shared before. That is incredible. But yeah, everyone's just very grateful for what you had to share today. If there's not any more questions, I just once again want to thank everyone for taking your time out of the busy afternoons to spend this afternoon with me and John. And hopefully, as I know John did a wonderful job. He did a really good job. And for me personally, when I go out and speak personally, I always just hope that everything that we talked about, it made sense and it's helping you on your path and the journey that you're walking in that sense. And another reminder too, because I know with these kind of conversations, if you do have any more questions or any more thoughts, I can only speak for myself, but I know John is open too, just from the presentation that he shared, that we are people you can reach out to in that case if you have any other questions, and we would be more than willing to have a conversation. You never know, it might lead to a cup of coffee down the road in that case, and to just continue building those relations in that regard. So once again, let me thank you, John, for taking the time out of your busy, afternoon in that sense, and all the projects and everything you have going on. I'm very just honored that you were able to be with us this afternoon and share your story and knowledge. One thing I found at the pandemic is I miss being in the circles and being around, folks in our community, people who do share knowledge in that case. So this is very comfortable for me to sit with you and just hear your story in that regard. So I very much just appreciate it all in that case.
Thank you very much. And I hope everybody continues to be safe, continue to be healthy, and if you're on the road or somewhere, you have a safe journey back to your home fires.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And if it's warm here, but if it's cold where you are, because I don't know if we get people from all across Canada, either stay warm or get a good chance to go and cool off outside, since it's summer now for some reason in Alberta, even though we still got snow in that. So it's just how it feels. Yeah, exactly. So no, thank you everyone. This session is recorded, so we will make sure to put it on our YouTube page, and folks can watch it later. And I'll make sure to let John know too when it's available, so you can share it too with your contacts also. And we do have a resource list, and even too, John, I could reach out to you too. And I know you had so some books if you wanted to share, but if you wanted to just write them down on a list, I can absolutely send them down to everyone for sure.
Sure.
That would work perfect. So Marseille, everyone, have a good afternoon and take care. And yeah, hopefully these conversations, hopefully we can continue them absolutely through the Center for Race and Culture. So Marseille, take care.